Happy Tuesday, Rom.
Happy Tuesday as well. Okay, I'm not sure how many will show up today. We'll see.
Yeah, I feel like we are in the middle of vacations. People are getting the last vacations in before school starts up. And then next week, people will probably be out again for that one. So I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to have a few very slow weeks here.
Okay, and also I think most of the bandwidth is for the dist spec release.
I think it's very worthwhile to spend more effort over there.
Yes.
I am amazed. I know my Zoom is having a tough time with it, but I'm amazed as good of a time as it's doing so far with my shirt, because it's very much a green shirt on a green screen right now. So yeah, it's having a tough time.
But it's working remarkably well.
It is surprising how well it does work considering what it's working with. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and turn it off for a second just so you can get the comparison. Be like, oh, that's how bad it is for them right now. That's the comparison. So it doesn't have much difference there to work with.
Yeah. Okay. Not too bad. Yeah.
See, I got a different one. That one I like. Yeah, we'll give folks a few minutes, and if no one shows up again, we'll go ahead and just call this one again and focus on distribution. Hopefully we can get that knocked out.
Yeah, okay. So we're also almost done with the Zod release. So all the tiny bugs that we are finding here and there, we're sort of fixing. So we'll cut one final RC release, give it a couple of weeks, and then we'll cut the full release.
Very cool. It's been super helpful having all the test cases there from the Zot side. So
yeah,
looking forward to everything we can get from that. Yeah, I definitely didn't take much time to prepare this week. If we get a gathering of folks that want to talk about things, the two things I can think of is we can look through the Docker token authentication, or we can look at maybe like the HTTP auth spec, just kind of spend some time and say what pieces we want to focus on, what value do we have from these different specs there. Is that one wrong? I've also got a couple PRs sitting out there, and I think you are a maintainer on there as well. So if you want to go back and look at PR 2 and 3 over in the same working group repo, they can use an extra thumbs up, and that way we can get those merged. I think it's just, well, we got Jeff here as well. Jeff already gave his thumbs up on everything.
I was gonna say I got one of them, I'll get the others up.
I think you were the one person that gave the thumbs up on both of them. So
oh, hey,
You were on top of it back when we were asking for people to look at them. It's merged. Thank you, Rob. Cool. So I'm assuming Rob is looking at number 3 right now. So while he is doing that, I don't want to distract too much, but what would folks like to talk about today? Do you have any request? Or if not, I will throw up an option of 2 things. Okay, hearing no request. 2 options I'm thinking of talking about are either the Docker registry token specs that so many of us have been using for all these years, or the HTTP RFC 7235, which is HTTP auth, talking about the 401, the www authentication header, stuff like that. Given those 2, what would folks like to talk about today? Dig into. Or you can say neither and we just call the meeting early.
What was the second one with the 401? I'm trying to.
The RFC 7235 is the other one I was thinking about, which is just super generic HTTP auth, how that stuff works in the RFCs.
Okay.
Just to say, okay, this is what already exists out there today, what we can consider that we want to leverage, pieces we want to pick and choose from there. Rob and I can chat about the difference between the 401 and 403 response codes.
Well, we have no hope of syncing those up in the auth spec.
It's the challenge is they shouldn't be synced, but depending on the registry, I'm very picky on reg client, where if I see a 403, I say, that's it, I'm denied, go ahead and quit and exit out. And a lot of the other tools that they're following through the Docker spec, they will do the V2 ping, and then they'll go and talk to that specific repo with the credential already fetched and generated. And so depending on the registry I talk to, that works and sometimes it doesn't. The few times it doesn't, I ran into an issue with GCR where they were good on the first try, but then once I tried to do multiple, it had problems. So if I ever tried to like a cross repository blob mount, it was not happy with me. And then, yeah, I was playing with Zot the other day, and that was the conclusion Rob and I came to in the chat there, which was, go back, here's the header, go out and go use the header if you got the 401 and go generate your auth. And the 403 is like, nope, that's it, forget, go away. And when I was talking to Zot, since it didn't do the ping of V2, they're saying, oh, well, we're expecting you to go ping V2, and that's how you're supposed to do all the authentication. Of course, all of my testing, I never tested any authentication on Zot. I just leave all my APIs open on the local development environment.
I want to say even within like the registry clients, the one used by Containerd, the one used in distribution, the one used in the Docker CLI, it's one or the other. They only know how to handle 401s and not 403s. But there are several things we tried to actually implement in 403s with regards to like, yes, we know who you are, but no, you're not allowed to do this. And it actually just causes the client to just keep retrying it because it doesn't actually acknowledge that 403 is a valid thing. It only says, hey, it's either 401 or it means that we can retry it. And it's like, there's, literally every other status code in there as well.
That's an important one to realize there. Yeah, 403 for me was the hard fail. And so the fact that some people would take the 403 as a retry that's a different behavior.
Yeah, because they're basically saying that 401 means it's a hard stop because we're not authenticated. And so all the clients are basically, they know how to handle that because a 401 is a 401. But we started thinking back 403, and that caused it either caused the CLI to retry, or I think in build kit it made it so instead of doing a post, it tried the same thing with the get. But yeah, there's at least 2 or 3 clients that we found that broken in. Yeah, and I was trying to, hey, maybe these things should actually honor status codes and not try to parse for error text.
That I definitely agree with. I'll go ahead and share just for the sake of sharing, and we can chat through some of the stuff. We can always switch to the other stuff if you want to chat about the other side. And let's see here. This guy, open up a chat window. Open up this window so I can mute myself if I ever need to. And yeah, this is just chatting about the 7235 spec. Been around for a while. And I think the important stuff in here when we're getting into authentication is, yeah, we got different schemes and the challenges, that stuff. Feel free to tell me I need to go back up somewhere else. It does talk about the realms. I know we see that in a lot of the different token authentication. But I feel like the big one here is that the 401 is what they define. Where they're saying, hey, when you get the 401, that means you need some credentials. And I think in here, I thought it said it needed the header. Yes. Must send the header. So that was a key step for me, is saying, hey, you can do the 401, but you also need to set the www authenticate header.
What? Do we have to restate this? My understanding is this is an expectation of a 401, right?
Correct. I'm discussing it's not that we want to put this in our spec, but just so that we know what HTTP specs are out there today, so that we can say what we want to leverage, what we don't need to completely rewrite because it's already written into this HTTP spec.
But the fact that we have to go to /v2, is that the point?
So the V2 implementation and all of that, that is, to me, it's a Dockerism. And so that is where I want to raise a question of how much of that do we want to re-implement on our side versus just falling back and saying, all we defined so far in OCI is these are the endpoints. If you hit an endpoint, you need authentication, it should give you a 401. That gets more complicated the farther you get into it, because you might have authentication for one repository and not the other repository, and you start using the same token to different places. If I have a repository to pull image A, and then I go to image B and try to pull, that should still be a 401, but the registry needs to know that it needs to send a 401 for that. That's at least my personal take. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are other registries that say, no, if you've got a token already, then yeah. Yeah, Rob, you got some comments there on the V2 ping. I see you saying that for the multi-tenancy, how that breaks. The one way that when you do the multi-tenancy there, if you don't ping the V2 and you're just directly querying them, the question is, does a registry know that it shouldn't give you a 403 back when you use a token for a different repository? That it should give you a 401 rather than a 403. That would be an open question I think we should think about.
Should the registry 404 you if you go to a repo that you don't have access to?
So what I'm hoping for, if you don't have access, that it gives you a 401. Says you don't have access over here, but here's where you can go get your token. It depends on the kind of token that you're getting back, I think. Registries might be able to be a little bit more intelligent about this. Say, hey, we know that you got a token for image A. We know your credential is so-and-so. You potentially can go back and get it. maybe they've got some knowledge in that token that they can tell whether or not you're allowed to get image B. But if they don't, and they see you got a token for image A, they should say, hey, it's this a 401 for image B. Go back and get a token for image B.
That's kind of hard though, because that's technically a 403. That's
Yeah.
we know who you are, you're authenticated, you just don't have access to this one.
It should be forbidden at that point. Or a 404 because you don't want to disclose it also. Or any path. It depends on how you access it also.
That's the thing is it entirely depends on how you access it. So if you're copying an image from one repo to another, if you're doing a cross-repository blob mount, should the client be required to know that it needs to send different HTTP headers for those different requests, or can it just keep reusing the HTTP auth token as it's going around the repository at different places?
Oh, I guess we have to document cross mount. That's the only way out. There's no other way.
Not just the cross mount, but just copying from one repo to another. If you're copying images across, you're going to have two different repos you're talking to. Maybe it's cross repo, but maybe you're doing some other stuff.
I mean, kind of going back to the 401, 403, it's somewhat complicated by the way the spec is currently defined. Because you're right that 403 is, we know who you are, but you don't have access. But because the way the spec is written, hey, I request a resource and it tells me 401, redirect here, and here's where to ask for access to that. If I use that token on a different repo, I don't know if I don't have access or I just haven't asked for access yet. Like those are two different things. And so if I have a token and I try to get a repo that I don't have, that my token says I don't have access to, the registry doesn't know, you specifically don't, your user does not have permission to access this repository, or it may be that you do need to do a 401 redirect and then go ask for access to that. This is kind of that whole issue that we experimented with and have failed miserably in, is sort of defining that whole, when you ask for access, if you are unauthorized for something, to return a 200 OK with empty scopes versus returning a 403, that broke everything for a myriad of reasons. But basically, the predefined, or the current behavior right now is me as a user, my username and password are correct. I ask for access to, I don't know, one of Brandon's repos. My login is correct. I don't have access. The current expected behavior is to get back a valid token with no scopes, instead of returning back a 403 saying, we know who you are, but you don't have access to this repository. And that sort of puts us in a pickle where we have to support that use case, even though ideally it'd be nice to send back a 403 at that point, because we know you're not allowed to. But all the existing clients and registries expect to get a valid token with no scopes. So I guess all that to say, I wish we could use a 403, but realistically, what 403 doesn't mean anything in our context here.
Yeah, the big challenge for me is as you get that one that has no scope and then you try to use that somewhere else that you do have access. It's the difference between a short run client and a long running server. That's a key thing to think about. If you've got a long running server that's making a lot of connections to a registry server, it may want to keep reusing that same token over and over again instead of regenerating the auth process for everything it's talking to. And how long are you allowed to reuse that same token? What area are you allowed to keep reusing that same token? We never defined it so far, so that's, I think, what we're going to be defining in this project. Other than that, the big thing this spec defined was the authenticate header itself. And so they go into details on what that is. So you got the realm, different stuff in there you can use. So I think a lot of that is important. And yeah, then you pass back your response to the server. So this exists today. We can leverage this. They don't even define the 403 in here, but yeah, good times. They don't tell us. It would be nice to know when clients should stop using a token.
I mean, at least in
No.
regards to the way the JVTs currently work, I mean, there is like an expiration field on the JVT, but I guess that's specifically assuming that the authorization returns a JVT, which maybe not every registry decides to use.
Yeah, it's both expiring for time, but also for scope, what repo you're talking to, what access you're requesting within that repo. So there are multiple reasons that an old credential may no longer be good and you need to go get a new one. In my own code, the logic that I've been using is I keep track of the list of different scopes that I'm requested to get. And if I query a URL and I get a different scope, then I add that to my list. And if I get a 401 and my scope doesn't change and I've already done the authentication before, then I say, okay, I'm going to take this as an authentication fail at that point because I already had the previous scope. My token hadn't expired. I just tried this just a second ago and I thought it should have worked and it didn't work. So I've got the retry logic in there. And so if I get the second 401 after the first 401, then I fail out. I don't know how universal that is in other clients, though. Or if I'm following the spec properly by doing that. So that's HTTP spec. Do we want to keep chatting about this, or do we want to chat about the Docker implementation?
So just quick question. Are you seeing registries return 403 or 401 right now? Even though you have authenticated?
For the most part, they return a 401. The two exceptions I ran into, Rob and I were back and forth on one, so that might be a temporary exception that won't happen anymore in the future. The other one that I ran into was a cross repository or just a multi-repository with GCR. They wanted each repository to have a separate auth request, and they weren't going to do anything there. That was GCR. GAR, though, does not have that issue. And since GCR is being deprecated, that problem may go away here in the very short future.
So should we have registries return 403 if you have a credential that's valid across the scope?
I think the registry would need to know that you tried to authenticate to that repository and that you failed. And I don't know if that knowledge is in the tokens that are out there today.
It does have a service and the scopes in there.
Yeah, but like Jeff was saying, if you don't have authentication to a lot of stuff, a lot of the registries give you an empty scope on your token.
Well, a lot of, I mean, that breaks a lot of things. That breaks a lot of things with cross mount, because a lot of like the cross mounting tools will, I mean, when you cross mount something against registry, or against Docker Hub actually gets the auth request for your GCR repo or your Azure repo, because all of those token scopes are passed through that request, because you're trying to mount something from GCR into Docker Hub, and clearly your Docker Hub credentials do not grant you access to that. What we did is we had basically responded back with 403 saying, you are not allowed to do this. Like, we know your user is a valid user, but you do not have access to this repository, which you've asked to. But that then breaks all the downstream tooling, because those tools are designed to, if we ask for access and don't get it, still return me a valid session, still return me a valid token that I can use for everything else, but don't explicitly fail me for other things. So it's a complicated situation there of, we can make you ask for one at a time, so we can explicitly deny each one or allow each one. But in a world where you can ask for permissions to 20 different repositories or 30 different repositories, and if you have it denied on one of them, what do we do?
So now I really want to know about the clients that are sending an authentication token that they got from Google or somewhere else and trying to use that to log into Docker.
I mean, I'm trying to think of which ones. I think it's just part of the registries. It's part of the mount redirect inside of the distribution code. I think is where the core of the problem is. If you try to do a mount from a different registry, the Docker Hub like the open source distribution will pass that repo that's in a completely different registry to Docker Hub and say, hey, ask for permission on this. And so maybe that's a bug in distribution. Maybe that's a thing that we need to fix in the OCI distribution spec. But from what I saw, most of the tools will fall victim to that, but that's because that's what distribution tells them to do.
That new behavior or old behavior? Because we might have been pushing new stuff lately. They've been doing like the anonymous blob mounts, and I feel like there's been a push to try to get cross registry when you've got different regions within something like multiple Azure regions out there that you want to copy from one to the other, and you might have access on multiple.
I think from what I can tell, that's old behavior. That's been that way.
Interesting. Yeah, in all of my code, I only send the credential, the token or whatnot, back to the registry it requested. I don't send it to a different registry every time I change registries.
But that's what I'm saying. Like it is. So if you try to push an image to Docker Hub that mounts something from GCR, Docker Hub will tell you in the credential. So based off of the distribution spec, will say, hey, the mount request to do the mount, you need to get permission, pull access on GCR, whatever. And it will pass that to the auth as the auth request on Docker Hub. So if I'm pushing Docker Hub, trying to cross mount from GCR, the Docker Hub auth server will say, I need pull access to GCR, which it will say, yeah, I can't do that. No. And we wanted to say, this is a 403. We don't do this. This is denied. But doing so basically failed the entire mount, failed the entire push. And so instead we had to relax that to say, even if you don't have access, we'll just ignore it and say, yeah, we're just going to pretend that we're going to pretend you didn't ask for it, because that doesn't exist.
Yeah, like the spec itself. We added the anonymous blob mount just recently, and I feel like the response to that was, if you ever try to do that, talking and scrolling at the same time is difficult. Yeah, if you ever try to do one of these mounts, and the from option we updated in recent updates to say that is optional. If it works, you just say 301, you're done. If it doesn't work, and this could even include that, hey, you just don't support it at all, it's supposed to be a 202. And then you're supposed to get back at that point the URL you're supposed to be uploading to. And so it shouldn't even be an auth at that point. It should just come back and say, hey, maybe it's an auth for push access into Docker Hub, but it's not an auth for the repo you're trying to pull from. At this point, it's just saying, hey, here's your upload location. Go ahead and send us the code. You didn't get a successful 201, so this thing wasn't created. But here's the URL you can do an upload to.
Well, but that's kind of maybe the limitation of the current token spec, is that we can't say, yes, you asked for this repository, but we denied it. We just say, yeah, we're just going to completely ignore it. And so when the registry processes that mount request, it doesn't know, yes, you asked for it, but you didn't get it, and so I'm going to return a 202. It says, well, your token doesn't say anything about it, so I'm just going to pretend like you never asked for it and it doesn't exist, kind of a thing. So we basically have to update the token spec to not just kind of, here's a list of all the approved scopes you have, but also here's a list of everything you asked for with a Boolean true false, whether or not we actually granted it, kind of a thing, which might be a fun exercise to experiment with. But
yeah, what would be interesting to me is if I say that I'm Brandon on my own repo and I try to do a cross repository, so not a cross registry, but a cross repository blob mount. And I'm just pulling an Alpine as my base image, something like that, into something I'm pushing, so I can just copy those Alpine layers over because it's already up there. If I haven't generated a token to pull Alpine already, and I try to do that push, what I'm curious of is, should the registry generate a 401 that says, hey, you've got a token that says you're allowed to push to your repo, but we don't know whether or not you're allowed to pull the Alpine image. You probably do, but technically you don't. And so should that be a response back to the client that says, hey, go do a quick authentication, make sure you've got pull access to that Alpine, give us an updated token that has that. And so the challenge is, should a registry do that? If it should, how does it know when it needs to do that? Because the token it has today may not necessarily say, if you try to get pull access to the Alpine and you didn't, maybe it wasn't Alpine, maybe it was some other private repo. If you try to get that, is that just excluded from your output token? It's not like a token that says, I tried to get access to the Alpine repo and it was explicitly denied. It's just, it's not there. And so how does it differentiate between the scope just isn't there in the token versus you've never even tried to get the scope in the token?
yeah, I feel like in order to support that use case, we need to actually include that information in the token.
So the login fails should be in the token that says, hey, they tried to log into this repo, they failed. And then the registry can properly give you a 403 back from that.
Right, because it goes into that point, the registry knows, yes, they tried, but I mean, that way the registry can tell the difference between they were denied versus they never asked or something.
That would make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, because right now, the way it's written, if you ask for it and you don't get it, we just exclude it from the token, which then makes the registry not know, are they allowed to, or do they just never ask?
Yep. So I feel like we can do all of that within the context of what's already in this spec today without any drastic changes. It's just how the tokens are generated. And so maybe there's some discussion on what that looks like in a JWT for an average registry. There might be a question on distribution itself, though, of whether or not it could support something like that.
I mean, I think we'd have to definitely do some enhancements in order to have it support it. Considering this would be, oh yeah, we'd have to be careful with that. Because explicitly adding that might make it so that by default, the distribution will start granting you access to things you're not supposed to, unless you first update distribution to block that.
I would worry about a flip scenario of someone has an old token server of some kind that's authentication server that's generating this stuff that doesn't know that it's supposed to generate a token with a denied field in there. And so you're just going to get in a loop where you're constantly saying, hey, I haven't seen whether or not you have access, go back and get another token, and you just keep doing that in a circle. That's my fear. Cool. So anything more we want to talk about over on the HTTP spec? Sajay is apparently dealing with 407 headers right now. I'm feeling bad for you, Sajay.
307. Because
307, sorry.
I couldn't get that response code into the distribution spec because authentication issues. Right now in the distribution spec, we say it only should return 200 for a blob, whereas technically most implementations return a 307. And there's some implicit stripping off, like things like the authentication token when you follow the URLs and whatnot, right? So
Sorry, I have to look up my HTTP codes when you say them.
no, yeah. So the challenge here is that the accepted codes in the distribution spec as written right now requires you to return a 200. And the follow also needs you to strip off the authentication headers when you follow. And that can both be a security challenge as well as how many times can you go with redirects and things like that. So there's some implicit implementation of, I think, 10 times that redirects might be followed in, I think it's in containerd. And how do other clients implement this? So
containerd may have some of their stuff, but I know a lot of this is directly in the Go libraries.
yes. So the thing was, maybe I can give the PR that kind of spawned this, or rather at least the issue. Let me pull that issue up and I can share it.
Did you want me to stop sharing my screen? Or if you drop the link, I'll share it. Am I the only one that always goes to http.cat to figure out all my HTTP status codes?
It's 397 in the issues.
Thanks. Yeah, we don't have it in the spec today, but I feel like
So Mike was asking whether this is an authentication issue on the call last time.
Maybe for an implementation. I don't know for the spec.
Yeah, I don't know either. That's what I was kind of like. We need to call this out somewhere, because if you read the spec, it kind of like the must is only a 200. Or we should at
So-
least say that we could defer to, like you said, the other portion of the RFC is also accepted.
Yeah, my feeling is at the top of the spec or the bottom or something like that, just have a section up there that just says, we delegate to these HTTP specs. Make sure your server is talking proper HTTP and implements all of these. That way we don't have to get into too much detail and we're just focusing on individual APIs at that point.
No, that's fine. That's also reasonable. But how to follow 307 is also a little tricky. Because there's the number of times you can actually get redirected versus how do you strip off the authentication if you're going from one to the other? Because typically the registry return a SAS URL or something like that, right? And then you have to kind of make sure your authentication header doesn't flow along.
My impression was that those headers shouldn't with the regular client.
That's what.
Oh,
So it's client implementation. It's not the spec interpretation, is what I was thinking.
I would need to dig into the client to see if they're doing that. The spec itself, I suspect, just says, hey, follow the URL, and
You're right.
all those other headers shouldn't be going with it. Maybe you get a reverse header, but you wouldn't get all the other auth and other kind of headers in there. But I would have to go dig that one up. In HTTP, at least they've got some default settings for redirects, everything else in there as well. And that's just handled under the covers. So I won't go digging into source code today, but that should just be handled according to the HTTP specs by whatever tool you're running, ideally. Anything more over here? Or do we want to chat a little bit about how Docker does it? So Docker, let's see, do they specify the v2 ping in here yet? They specify how to get the token.
I don't think there's anything in there about v2 ping.
Yeah, I know it's in the code. That's where I found it when I was first trying to implement it. I was digging through the distribution code to find it. So it does define at least the 401. And they do in here define. Yeah, either define the service, the scope, all that, what access you need. It defines the two types of access, which is pull and push. But in here, I don't think we've defined anything else. There's no extra definition in here saying if you're doing like some kind of search request, if you're doing any kind of any global requests that's still in the catalog API, something like that. None of those are in here.
Yeah, well, some of that Docker Hub explicitly doesn't do catalog API since it's not in spec.
A lot of this though is Docker distribution.
Yeah.
So does indicate that, hey, we're heavily relying on all of this stuff. So we can pull this one up later on.
And I want to say officially, I think the only three defined there are pull, push, delete. I think they're the only three scopes that are valid, but I don't think they're actually laid out anywhere.
And see, I've never seen delete out there. That would be a first for me. If I ever want to do a delete, I just got this push access. So at this point, we're getting into JOT definitions. What's inside of that token? Some of this is registry talking to its authentication server. How much do we care about what is inside of a JOT from the authentication? And how much do we just want to say between a client and the registry server, treat that as a black box? Whatever you get back as your token, you pass that along and you don't try to dissect what's inside of it? Or do we want to say, expect this to be a JOT and you should be interpreting it somehow?
I would say in general, I think it should be a black box. I mean, if people want to say, hey, what's in here, because I'm curious about what's in there, that's fine. But I think clients trying to parse and override or try to do some clever logic in there, it's probably unhelpful and unwise.
I think I've seen both where this JOT is not parsable, or the point is we assume it's a JOT. I've seen both. That's why I've seen.
You use the magic word there, so that's why I'm smiling. That dang assumption gets us in trouble every time. Someone will not make it a JOT.
Yeah, and really, there's nothing that says it has to be.
Right.
It's literally that this is a token. You know, it could be a session. I don't know what. It could be anything for all I care. But for the spec, it's just this is a signed token that you can use to pass in. So
from the perspective of us defining the spec, we shouldn't focus on the registry server interacting with its authentication server. That's entirely on the that's entirely on the registry side, and our spec definition is just between the client and the server. Is that we kind of in agreement there?
I think so. Yeah.
I like making that definition. I like putting that order in there, but just want to make sure that I'm not alone.
I mean, I could probably go either way. Like I could probably be fine with saying, hey, it must be a JOT. And you must, you know, here's the claims. I mean, you could do that, but at the same time, it's also not necessarily relevant either. So if a different registry implementation has a different way they want to do it, as long as you request scopes the same way, what they give you in response, as long as you can turn around and pass that straight to the registry, and the registry has the same behavior based off of whatever that token represents, then should be fine. I've also been burned by the fact that some different registry clients will we found this will parse the www authenticate URL and parse it and then reformat it based on how the client wants to send it, and that will strip out different scopes and strip out different things in there that it deems invalid, even though that's what the distribution server responded with. And that is kind of left a sour taste in my mouth if I don't want the client mucking in the middle. Like if the distribution returns this back, you know, that's what you call the auth server with. If the auth server returns something, that's what you pass to the registry server.
So feel like what I've seen from older versions of the Docker client, maybe new versions have changed this, is that all they looked at was hitting the V2 API and seeing what is my service. I don't even know if they looked at the scope, but they looked at what server you're going to talk to, what's the service name. And then from everything after that, they were generated in the client side.
Yeah, some older versions of the Docker client will parse the scopes into repositories. And then
it was generating the scope as a repository. It was generating the authentication need, or the, whether it was a push or a pull. It was generating that part of the request, and it was building all that up client side based off the V2 ping, hitting the auth server, getting a token back from that, and then using that to do the push or pull.
Yeah, so it was doing that rather than just taking what the distribution server returned with of hit the auth server with this URL. Yeah, it was kind of parsing it and rebuilding it itself based off of other information.
Yeah, the comment you made, though, definitely has me thinking back to some of my own code, because what I'm wondering is, when I'm parsing this, because I do actually parse back the response to the auth header, because what I'm trying to get out of there is the scope, the service, those different fields that are in a normal auth header, because I may have multiple scopes if I'm talking to multiple repositories on the same registry server.
Yeah, so specifically speaking, we did an internal, I would say a Docker, we did an internal POC of attaching on the tag to the scope as well. So it'd be the repository plus the tag. So that way we can do fine-grained access based off of, hey, you can be denied certain tags or be allowed certain tags. And auth server was great. Distribution server handled it perfectly fine. But depending on what client you use, some of the clients would just strip out the tag. They wouldn't include it because they parsed it and then rebuilt it. So that was an unfortunate.
I think there are a lot of those out there. Part of it, let's dig through here. We only got a few minutes left, so I want to see if I can find some of the code in here that talks about. So I'll apologize in advance for any fast scrolling I'm doing. It's refresh token. I don't care about that. Subject audience. This is probably getting into some of the chop stuff. Don't care about that. But some of this, let's see, we got the 401 registry response back. I'm looking to see if we have anything in here that talks about some of that V2 API, the V2 ping. Yeah, see, that was actually trying to do a full push there. We did at least define these things. Now, was it that you had something inside of the scope and it was pulling the scope apart and saying, hey, I know you said that it was repository and push, but I'm going to put in some of my own stuff in there. Is that what it was doing?
Yep.
Okay. At least I don't think I do that. If you give me a scope, I'll take that same scope. So yeah, in all of this, I don't think we go through some of that ping workflow. And I know, Ram, you've seen that. I've seen some of that as well, of what that client workflow looks like with the ping of the V2 generating and generating some other stuff off of that. So maybe a good next step for us next week is to look at some of that implementation to get a good feel for that in terms of what's happening over on, probably all over in distribution. Dig in there. Does that sound like a good use for our time next week, or do people want to take this different direction?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start.
Cool. With that, anything else with the last few minutes, or should I give you back a quick little minute or two before your next meeting?
Thanks a lot. Thanks, folks.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good rest of the day. See everybody on Thursday.